Good afternoon. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the Jerome Hall lecture at the Maurer School of Law. Jerome Hall, a faculty member at the school for 30 years, was a legal philosopher and noted scholar in the area of criminal law and jurisprudence. This lecture series in his name is one of the signature events of our Center for Law, Society, and Culture and brings influential scholars of law and society to the school each year. Previous Jerome Hall lecturers have included Thomas Green, Sandy Levinson, Joseph Raz, and Michael Olivas. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Rachel Moran, the Dean and Michael J. Connell Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law. Dean Moran began her teaching career at the UC Berkeley School of Law, and in 2008 joined the UC Irvine Law School as a founding faculty member. In 2010, she was appointed dean at UCLA. Dean Moran writes and lectures extensively on educational policymaking and the law, with an emphasis on questions of equity and access, as well as on civil rights and anti-discrimination law. Her many publications include the books Interracial Intimacy, The Regulation of Race and Romance, Race Law Stories, and a leading casebook on educational policy and the law. Her deep commitment to legal education is reflected not only in her research, but in the national leadership roles she has taken on, among them the presidency in 2009 of the Association of American Law Schools. Today's lecture is entitled Clark, Kerr and Me, The Future of the Public Law School. And after the lecture, you're all invited to join us for a reception in the faculty lounge upstairs. Now, please join me in welcoming Dean Moran.
Well, first I want to thank Dean Bucksbaum for that generous introduction and also for all the wonderful arrangements that have been made for my visit here. And I also wanted to thank Lauren Robel, who has been my colleague at the Association of American Law Schools, has now what we call at UCLA gone across the street from her deanship to Central Campus, because for us, our central administration building is directly across the street from the law school, but is now the president of the Association of American Law Schools and playing her own leading role in shaping the future of legal education. And finally, I wanted to thank all of you for joining me today. It's really a great pleasure to give this lecture at another top-ranked public law school that is facing some of the challenges that we are, and I very much look forward to our discussion and to brainstorming about the future of public legal education. So let me start by saying a little bit about Clark Kerr. Clark Kerr has long enjoyed an iconic status among leaders in public higher education. The former president of the University of California left a lasting impression on the national scene with his Godkin lectures on the future of colleges and universities delivered at Harvard in 1963. Now, he spoke at a moment when public higher education, and indeed higher education more generally, were enjoying a renaissance of energy and vision. After World War II, veterans returned and reinvigorated the student body with the support of the GI Bill. And state legislatures funded public institutions generously to keep tuition low so that post-secondary education would be affordable and accessible. This state support in turn assured the kind of quality instruction necessary to prepare adults for the complexities of the workplace and civic life at a time of increasingly sophisticated technology and an explosive growth in knowledge. The federal government pumped grant money into the sciences to wage the Cold War, and private industry saw the potential for gain by investing in promising new research with possible commercial applications. The expansion in the programs and activities at colleges and universities was so dynamic and diverse that Kerr dubbed institutions like the University of California multiversities. But if Kerr's rise to prominence seemed rapid, his fall from grace was just as sudden. In the wake of anti-war protests at the University of California campuses, especially Berkeley, he was summarily dismissed from his post by then-Governor Ronald Reagan in 1967. Kerr returned to a relatively modest, some might even say obscure, existence at the Berkeley campus. People sometimes wondered whether he was still alive. One day, as I was riding with a longtime law professor at Bolt Hall, he turned to me and pointed out a nondescript man in a trench coat walking down the sidewalk. "That's Clark Kerr," my colleague said. It was as though I had glimpsed the last of a vanishing species, a kind of exotica, and I felt the poignancy of this once influential leader who had now become an object of curiosity. I have to confess that when I first learned about Clark Kerr, I was reminded of the myth of Icarus. It seemed that Kerr had flown too high, too close to the sun, and been humbled for his precocious display of virtuosity. But in truth, Icarus was never an apt comparison for Kerr. For one thing, there was the good humor and the good grace that he displayed when he learned of his dismissal. He quipped that he was leaving the job as he began it, fired with enthusiasm. There was no arrogance in that tongue-in-cheek observation, and in reading his book on the uses of the university, I found only an erudite voice and a lively mind. In fact, his naive faith in moderate, managerial leadership as the key to stability and success in the modern multiversity revealed not a trace of hubris, albeit, in retrospect, perhaps a hint of political naivete. And so I have discovered that the poignancy I felt on the occasion of citing Clark Kerr had even deeper roots than I had appreciated at the time. The state of California has built the single greatest system of public higher education that the world has ever known. And we have 2 flagship campuses rated among the great global universities at Berkeley and UCLA. And, like one of the university's great leaders, this system has increasingly taken on the colorations of an endangered species, yet another form of exotica headed for extinction in a state with a steadily declining commitment to its colleges and universities. The purpose of this talk is to reflect on whether there will be a second act, if not for Kerr himself, then for the vision of public higher education that he cherished and nurtured. Kerr believed that public colleges and universities were integral to the health of our economy and the legitimacy of our democracy, a foundational conviction that I share. In this lecture, I will focus on the sector of public higher education that I know best, the public law school. To that end, I want to talk briefly about the history of public law schools before I turn to the unique mission they pursue and the current difficulties they face. And I will close, I think you'll be glad to hear, with some reasons to be hopeful about their prospects and some steps that we must take to secure their future. So let me begin with the innovation of public legal education, because, in fact, public law schools are something of a recent innovation. At the nation's inception, the few law schools that existed were typically private, freestanding institutions. So in the early 1820s, colleges or universities that sought to establish a law school typically absorbed a private one. Indeed, the most successful example of liberal law teaching took place at the University of Virginia, a public institution that reflected Thomas Jefferson's abiding belief in the significance of the citizen lawyer to a robust republic. The rise of Jacksonian democracy in the 1920s threatened formal legal education, whether public or private. A populist backlash included an attack on instructional requirements that were seen as creating an elitist and exclusionary class of lawyers. States grew increasingly permissive about allowing attorneys to train through apprenticeships rather than at law schools, and so lawyers typically apprenticed in private law offices after paying substantial fees to practitioners, particularly those with a reputation as strong teachers and mentors. Ironically, then, the reliance on practitioners as tutors privatized legal education in the name of populism. Yet there was no sense of contradiction in equating privatization with access, in part because the shift to apprenticeships was accompanied by an elimination or wholesale reduction of barriers to entry to the profession. In 1842, for instance, New Hampshire provided that any citizen over the age of 21 could be admitted to practice law in the state. This approach achieved democratization of the profession by stripping it of any claim to special knowledge. Indiana had become a state in 1816, shortly before Jacksonian democracy began to sweep the country. And the newly revised state constitution, which was adopted in 1851, provided that, and I quote, "Every person of good moral character, being a voter, shall be entitled to practice law in all courts of justice." And this provision remained in place until the 1930s here in this state. So as a result, lawyers and judges often were administering the justice system without the benefit of a law degree. Now, whatever the danger an elitist bar might pose, a wholly untrained lawyer was ill-equipped to deal with the nuances of judicial decisions, statutes, rules, and regulations. The law, as it turns out, was not so common after all. To remedy concerns about poorly trained lawyers, the University of Indiana pressed to establish a law school beginning in the mid-1830s. But only in 1842 did the campus succeed, when David McDonald, a circuit court judge and Bloomington resident, became a professor of law. McDonald agreed to serve only if the school term was shortened to 3 months so that he could continue to serve as a judge. The law program began as a 2-year undergraduate program with 2 terms each year. In Judge McDonald's inaugural address, he clearly linked formal legal education to the foundations of a healthy democracy. He wrote, "Other calamities may befall a nation, and it may survive them. But when the laws by which the people are governed and protected have fallen into disrepute, revolution or ruin is the inevitable consequence. To study our jurisprudence as a science and to be thoroughly learned in its precepts are not only honorable to us as lawyers and necessary to a wise administration of justice, but of the highest moment to the permanence of our political institutions." Now, it is worth noting that Indiana Bloomington School of Law has continued to take its obligations as a premier source of high-quality legal education seriously in the intervening years. Not only has the law school risen steadily in the national rankings, but it has become a leading source of timely and relevant research on both legal education and the legal profession, and you have several really noted scholars in those areas. Now, by comparison to Indiana Bloomington School of Law, UCLA School of Law is a mere infant, having been founded in the late 1940s after World War II. By then, the American Bar Association and the Association of American Law Schools had succeeded in achieving newfound respect for law schools by professionalizing legal education through an increasingly rigorous accreditation process. State legislatures were showing a growing inclination to fund public law schools at the levels necessary to meet these high standards. Far from having to overcome the legacy of Jacksonian populism as Indiana Bloomington did, UCLA law was buoyed by an unprecedented wave of post-World War II prosperity and possibility, the very moment that Kerr would likely describe as a golden age for higher education. The importance of the rule of law had been made evident through the ravages of Nazism and the cruelties of the Holocaust. The United States, now viewed as the leader of the free world, was a defender of democratic ideals rooted in liberty and equality. Esteem for law schools grew as a result, and their prospects within a flourishing university were brighter due to these developments. Now, Roscoe Pound, a former Harvard Law School dean, joined the UCLA law faculty after the school's founding to participate in the excitement of this new undertaking. His remarks at the dedication of the law school building reflect his sense of the special obligations of the public law school, obligations that permeated its teaching, research, and service. And I'm going to just give you a brief excerpt from his dedication speech. There is no way of learning a field of the law like teaching it to well-educated students, such as alone are now admitted to study in accredited American law schools. Likewise, there are special advantages for the work of a law teacher as to taking on part of the work of a ministry of justice in the method of instruction from adjudged cases which prevails in our law schools. Teaching the law in action from study of its operation rather than by indoctrination is a real preparation for effective activity to initiate and promote legislation for improving the administration of justice. I submit that a duty is cast upon the faculty of the law school of a state university, both as members of the teaching profession and as members of the legal profession, to exercise the learned arts they pursue in the spirit of a public service in the great and needed service of taking upon themselves the role of a ministry of justice. By the time Roscoe Pound dedicated the new UCLA Law School building, public legal education was well established, and its special ethic of service was substantial and significant. Though never denominated a ministry of justice, in the intervening years, UCLA law acted as a first mover in many areas, actions that suggest that the institution had a deep understanding of its public mission. The very first law school class that we graduated included several women, who were still a rarity in legal education at the time, as well as a student with disabilities. And in fact, one of the women graduated first in the inaugural class. True to this early tradition of access, UCLA School of Law led the way in diversifying its student body, and it remained among the most diverse law schools in the nation until the California voters did away with affirmative action by popular referendum in the mid-1990s. UCLA Law also played a pivotal role in developing clinical education programs in the 1970s, one of the key ways in which law schools inculcate norms of professionalism and an ethic of service to the community. UCLA Law's public interest program, now endowed by alumnus David Epstein, was in the vanguard of efforts to provide specialized training for students planning to pursue careers in public service and government. Today, the law school's critical race studies program remains unique in American legal education as a space for teaching and research that explores the hard questions about race and ethnicity that must be resolved if we are to be a people with a shared sense of identity and destiny. The Williams Institute on Sexual Orientation, Law, and Policy remains the first and only initiative of its kind at a U.S. law school, playing a pivotal role in generating the research and policy analysis necessary to address new civil rights challenges with their own dilemmas of equity, access, and inclusion. Finally, the Emmett Center on Climate Change and the Environment is the first program at any law school in the country that is devoted entirely to this pressing problem of global significance. Clearly, the notion of service that Roscoe Pound described at the law school's inception has shaped the evolution of the UCLA School of Law in the intervening decades. In that sense, it is fair to say that UCLA Law has been a truly public institution, one that has perceived no inconsistency between an ethic of service and an aspiration for greatness during its rapid ascent into the ranks of the premier law schools in the nation. Both Judge McDonald and Roscoe Pound linked public law schools to a particular vision of law and politics. McDonald saw high-quality instruction of law students as integral to the administration of justice and the permanence of political institutions in the state of Indiana. Pound's address is notable for its unabashedly activist account of the state university law professor's role in law training and reform, a boldly ambitious model that MacDonald could hardly have considered when he became the sole professor at Indiana Bloomington while continuing his work as a circuit judge. Both MacDonald and Pound believed that law schools could serve uniquely public functions without falling prey to politics, so long as the faculty had integrity and observed principles of objectivity coupled with a passion for justice. In retrospect, this faith in the power of pure reason may seem unworldly in a landscape now marked by partisan debate. But I think the ideals of leadership and service for the public law school remain significant. However, not everyone agrees with me. And so I wanted to turn now to a debate over whether there's anything unique about the public law school. In a provocative paper written in 1998, then Dean Richard Matisoar questioned the ongoing relevance of any distinction between public and private institutions of higher education. Now, according to Matisoar, the stereotypical differences between public and private colleges and universities have broken down. Once, he argues, a public school was seen as inexpensive, state-subsidized, and oriented to community service, which may sound familiar from the history we just went through, while a private school was considered expensive, market-based, and oriented to commercial concerns. So the public school was driven by this egalitarian democratic ethic, while a private school adopted a more elitist and authoritarian approach. Public institutions were limited by bureaucratic structure and financial struggles, while consumer-oriented private schools were seen as more nimble and well-supported. Now, according to Matisoar, public and private schools now converge around cost. Both are expensive because of the need to compete for students by adding new programs, facilities, and services, as well as the decline in state support for public higher education. With rising tuition, public and private schools alike benefit from state and federal support that goes directly to students in the form of grants and loans. And remember, when Clark Kerr was writing, federal support was going directly to the university for particular programs. Public schools have grown more entrepreneurial, and private schools more public-spirited. Schools, whether public or private, strive to stand out in the marketplace, and they must offer quality service to students to ensure satisfied consumers who graduate with the inclination to give back to their alma maters in the future, as all deans know. Both public and private colleges and universities now seek a diverse student body composed of the best and the brightest students from all walks of life, and every school is facing increased scrutiny of how it uses its dollars to fund the educational enterprise. Now, Matisoar focused on higher education in general, but Rex Perschbacher, who was then the dean of the University of California Davis School of Law, asked whether this analysis also suggested that the distinctions between public and private law schools had eroded. Perschbacher acknowledged that initially nearly all formal legal education was private, and that law schools did not emerge as part of a university education until the mid-19th century. That is, just at about the time that the University of Indiana Bloomington was establishing the state's first law school. And Perschbacher notes, even when the current form of university-based legal education took shape under Christopher Columbus Langdell at the Harvard Law School, I quote, there still was no obvious distinction between the mission of publicly affiliated law schools and privately affiliated law schools. But later, he claims, as law schools became increasingly professionalized, key differences related to price, mission, and accountability did emerge, and Perschbacher believes those distinctions remain real and compelling. So Perschbacher identifies several things that he thinks distinguish public and private law schools. First, he argues that public law schools are obligated to seek students from the broadest cross-section of the state public. Though a diverse student body is now a feature of both public and private law schools, the commitment to equal access and inclusion remains a special responsibility of state institutions. And indeed, the rise in diversity throughout higher education is one of the great transformations of 20th century colleges and universities, but it was public institutions that led the way, and private counterparts caught up after realizing the price that would be paid for continuing insularity and exclusion. Now, Perschbacher contends that public law schools also have a unique responsibility to provide training that prepares students for democratic leadership. To do this, schools must strive to hire a diverse faculty and staff, and they must offer a classroom experience that prepares students for influential roles as citizen lawyers. Perschbacher contends that public law schools must be especially sensitive to policy concerns and should offer clinical opportunities that enable students to serve the state and community. He emphasizes the need to support pro bono and public interest work and reminds us that public law school teachers and administrators should be particularly careful about their images and models because they speak, however attenuated the connection may seem, on behalf of the public. Perschbacher asserts that accountability is yet another unique but especially burdensome responsibility for public law schools, and he admits that it is difficult living in the glare of public scrutiny, but this is a burden, and I quote, that we should shoulder with as much grace as we can muster. Although the right of the public to know can be abused, Perschbacher believes that this scrutiny is essential to ensuring that public law schools remain reflective about their special obligations. In his view, public law schools must examine what we do in light of the public interest and ask how we are to locate that public interest more often than a private law school needs to. These obligations in turn are linked to the uniquely democratic and egalitarian tradition of public higher education. Now, the debate between Matissar and Perschbacher necessarily reflects changing notions about the proper province of the public domain. It is, after all, no accident that Governor Ronald Reagan sent Clark Kerr off to spend his later years as a largely unsung professor at the Berkeley campus. Reagan would spearhead a revolution that transformed our nation's understanding of what is properly within the public realm. And the answer seemed to be very little. For Reaganites, private actors nearly always delivered results superior to those generated by the public sector. So the goal was to rely on market principles and private processes as much as possible when allocating resources and delivering services. For Matissar, the legacy of that transformed understanding has been convergence and hybridity. The public looks increasingly private as pressures to compete grow and taxpayer support dwindles. But at the same time, the private college or university adopts appealing features of the public ethos, if that assists in the intense market competition for students. Perschbacher, by contrast, rejects this account of the vanishing hallmarks of a public identity for quintessentially state law schools. For him, public values are non-negotiable features of public law schools, which are constitutive of their identities and cannot simply be features of an attractive marketing campaign. As a result, a public school cannot abandon principles of equity and access if they become inconvenient, nor can it relinquish an ethic of pro bono and public service, even if it becomes unfashionable. One's views on the debate between Matissar and Perschbacher likely turn on ideological beliefs about the unique role of public law schools in training citizen lawyers and preserving a healthy democracy. In an earlier era, formal legal education of any kind was attacked as exclusionary and elitist. The Jacksonian democratic impulse treated access to law practice as a birthright of every adult citizen, no training required. Yet the complexity of law and policy meant that lawyers had to acquire requisite knowledge and skills. Without specialized instruction, attorneys could not master the rules and regulations needed to promote order and decency in an increasingly impersonal and uncertain world. That training could have been accomplished through purely private means, but states saw that law was critical to developing a sound infrastructure for thriving economies and robust democracies. This sense of a public interest in the law prompted the impulse to create public law schools. Today, the importance of law to democracy seems every bit as compelling as it did in the mid-1800s when Indiana Bloomington founded its law school. But as a society, we are less convinced that the public interest is best promoted through public law schools that embody the traditional norms of access, service, and accountability that Perschbacher prized and Pound praised. We have, at least recently until recently, with the collapse of the financial sector, become far more trusting of private avenues to the public good, and the result has been a growing set of challenges for the public law school. And I want to turn to those now because, truth be told, the verdict is still out on the debate between Richard Madisar and Rex Perschbacher over the distinctive nature of public law schools. And I think that this lingering doubt should come as no surprise, given the ongoing and widespread uncertainty about the kind of democracy we want to be, the type of government we want to have, and the nature of the public values that we hold in common and must preserve for future generations. Though the battle over the future of public law schools is part of a larger political zeitgeist, there are nonetheless features of this particular struggle that are worth singling out. First, I want to turn to access, because Perschbacher suggests that the question of access is vital to understanding the nature of a public law school. If the law school is to serve the people, it must be open to individuals from all walks of life with the talent, character, and will to become citizen lawyers of the finest caliber. For that reason, access to public legal education historically has been based on the ability to contribute rather than the ability to pay. The decline in state subsidies for public higher education in general and public law schools in particular has inexorably eroded this core principle of access. Although many commentators have argued that access to public colleges and universities is vital because they educate about 80% of the undergraduates in this country, the same cannot be said for public law schools. In part because legal education originally was highly privatized, public law schools are, as I mentioned, a relatively recent innovation, and they operate alongside a robust cohort of private institutions, some of which are freestanding proprietary enterprises, and some of which are housed at private universities. In fact, according to data from 2008-2009 that were collected by the American Bar Association, only 41% of all accredited law schools are public, but they enroll only 33% of all law students. Public law schools are on average smaller than private law schools, and they enroll fewer part-time students. But even if the case for public law schools cannot be made on sheer attendance numbers alone, these institutions certainly emerged because of intense dissatisfaction with a legal profession that adopted a wholly self-regarding, privatized ethic of training and practice. At the core of the push for public law schools was a conviction that they could safeguard the ideal of the citizen lawyer better than an exclusively private system of legal instruction would. Today, as state revenues for public law schools decline, there is a growing rhetoric of privatization and self-sufficiency. The law schools at the University of Michigan and the University of Virginia, two of the most prestigious public law schools in the country, already have moved in this direction, while those at Arizona State University and the University of Minnesota have announced plans to become self-sufficient. Typically, this rhetoric translates into rising tuition and intense pressure for private fundraising. Building an endowment has been like building wealth, and until recently, it has largely been the province of elite private institutions, and indeed Elena Kagan presided over the single largest fundraising campaign in history at Harvard. It was astonishing. Most public law schools have relatively small endowments, in part because of their traditional dependence on state support and their emphasis on keeping tuition and costs down to make their programs affordable and accessible. Consequently, many state law schools have become heavily tuition-driven as state support drops. With small endowments, public law schools struggle to offset rapid increases in tuition with equivalently large increments in financial aid. The upshot is that public legal education is generally more expensive than it used to be, and public law schools will not be able to preserve access and affordability without substantial infusions of money from private donors. One could hope perhaps for increases in state funds, but I'm not counting on them in this talk. Now, the shift in tuition costs actually coincides with changes in government policy on financial aid. And I want to say, unfortunately, that the coincidence is not a happy one. At one time, among developed countries, the United States had the highest proportion of college graduates among adults aged 25 to 34. Today, our country ranks 12th, in part because it stands alone among industrialized nations in requiring young people to self-finance higher education. As a consequence, students arrive at law schools, public or private, heavily burdened by debt. And because of the rising costs in tuition, they will take on more. At the same time, one of the great changes in higher education, the diversification of the student body, is under siege. Although public and private colleges and universities alike now aspire to admit a diverse student body, the war on affirmative action primarily has been waged at public schools, often public law schools. And indeed, the court will be hearing a case on affirmative action this term in Fisher versus Texas. Lawsuits have been filed against two of the leading institutions of public legal education, the University of Michigan and the University of Texas. The University of California law schools have been subject to federal inquiries into the permissibility of their admissions practices, as well as popular referenda that ban the use of racial or ethnic preferences. The result is that the challenges to achieving a diverse student body are now more substantial in public law schools than in their private counterparts, which retain greater flexibility and autonomy to administer their admissions processes. But I do want to say that I think, interestingly, there are emerging areas of concern about access in which public institutions continue to take the lead. In particular, the growing socioeconomic divide in the United States has raised significant questions about whether children from the most disadvantaged backgrounds are able to pursue higher education. Here, public institutions remain gateways to opportunity. Community colleges offer low-income and first-generation students a chance to get started on a degree, and campuses like Berkeley and UCLA are home to unparalleled numbers of Pell Grant recipients, students who by definition come from backgrounds marked by poverty and disadvantage. And in fact, each of 4 University of California campuses standing alone, Berkeley, Davis, UCLA, and San Diego, enroll more students on Pell Grants than the entire Ivy League combined. The picture for law schools, admittedly, is more complicated. According to a recent study by Richard Sander, only 18% of law students at top 10 schools came from the bottom 75% of the population in terms of socioeconomic status. For law schools ranked 11th through 20th, 24% did, while for those ranked 21st through 50th, 27% did. Conversely, at the top 10 law schools, 57% of the student body came from the highest 10% in terms of socioeconomic status, while at the schools ranked 11th through 20th, 49% did, and at those ranked 21st through 50th, 48% did. To the extent that elite law schools are pathways to leadership, it would appear that the most disadvantaged segments of our population are seriously underrepresented, even more so than is true in undergraduate programs at American colleges and universities. Sander notes that class stratification in U.S. law schools likely has intensified because of rising tuition, financial aid that is no longer as tightly tied to need, the failure to account for great inflation at elite private universities in the admissions process, the premium attached to resumes with interesting experiences more available to affluent students, and the persistence of legacy preferences. Sander observes that in response to the Regents' resolution and the popular referendum in California that ended racial and ethnic preferences in state college and university admissions, UCLA School of Law experimented with a class-based admissions process that sought to counteract socioeconomic disadvantages as measured by limited family wealth and education, as well as attendance at a secondary school in a high-poverty neighborhood. He concludes that the experiment had a dramatic impact on socioeconomic diversity in the law school class, with 1/3 of the students coming from the bottom half of the socioeconomic distribution, and the proportion in the highest levels of the distribution dropping substantially. Sander concludes that the effort succeeded in part because no other law school was interested in socioeconomic diversity. So UCLA Law faced little competition in attracting highly qualified students from the cohort it had identified as disadvantaged. He acknowledges that the experiment could not be replicated on a national scale, yet he observes that, quote, in the absence of a change in legal regime, it is unlikely that many law schools will institute even modest class-based preferences in the near future. The field is open for a few schools willing to show leadership in fostering socioeconomic status diversity, end quote. Now, whether such leadership will materialize in a world marked by declining state support and growing competition for law students who have high grades and LSAT scores is an open question. Sander himself appears skeptical, and his account makes no distinction between the public and private law school in imagining where such transformation might begin. Though he cites his own law school, he's a professor at UCLA Law, a public law school as a model, he does not suggest that this reform sprang from core notions of what it means to be truly public. Now, one might argue, of course, that in fact a commitment to access was critical to UCLA Law's decision to implement this experiment, a truly unprecedented one, I might add. But Sander seems tacitly, I think, to accept Matasar's view that the differences between public and private law schools, at least insofar as they bear on access, have largely disappeared. The primary axis of distinction for him appears to be elite status, whether public or private, which in turn correlates with a socioeconomically privileged student body. Now, the next area that I want to touch on is training for leadership. Providing access to a range of students is just the beginning of advancing a distinctly public mission. In justifying the University of Michigan Law School's efforts to promote diversity, the U.S. Supreme Court pointed out that this elite public school was a pathway to leadership. To build pathways to leadership, public law schools must train students to become citizen lawyers, and I believe that that ethic must not be confined just to public interest or government, but also must be inculcated in those who choose a career in private practice or business. So I do want to suggest, and I see that I'm running out of time and I want to get just quickly through the remainder of the talk, I think that clinical education will be critical, but I do think that public law schools cannot assume that people will naturally bridge the divide between elite forms of private practice in the private sector and more public-spirited versions of practice in government and public interest. Once upon a time, when tuition was low, people came to a public law school and they could imagine any kind of practice available. They didn't feel they had to choose early on between going into public interest or government or versus private practice. That is no longer the case. And so we must build curricula that connect up those ethics where we promote cooperation. And as one example, I wanted to mention efforts, for example, by our business law program to partner with our public interest program in providing a community development clinic. And so I think those kinds of ideas will be critical. And without those kinds of ideas, I worry that public law schools will no longer treat the ethic of service as something that applies across the board to all students, regardless of whatever careers they choose. With respect to transparency, I do want to say that I think this is an important value, but in the age of email, it is very easy to shoot off a message with a broad request and bind the university to engage in an intensive fact-finding and reporting effort. And it's also, I think, a way at times that people create an implicit threat of litigation. It's a way of lobbying, and it's a way of promoting negative publicity. All of that, I think, has led to a certain degree of paralysis among leadership. There's a book called Moneyball, which you may have seen. There's also a movie if you want to skip the book. But it describes how big league baseball managers often are afraid of making a high-profile, humiliating mistake, and that they prefer that to incurring the costs associated with perpetuating the status quo. And I think in colleges and universities as well, the costs of standing pat are sometimes simply taken for granted, and they are largely invisible to administrators and the general public. But change, on the other hand, is likely to trigger scrutiny and suspicion, the kind of backlash that can end the career of a university president, chancellor, vice provost, or, yes folks, dean. Now, the cost of living in a political fishbowl may be a decline in visionary leadership just when it is needed the most. There was actually a 2001 article entitled, "It's Lowly," at the top, "What Became of the Great College Presidents?" And Jay Matthews argues that it is increasingly difficult to find the kind of intellectual giants who once led colleges or universities, whether public or private. He believes that presidents today are primarily known, and I quote, as fundraisers and ribbon cutters and coat holders, filling a slot rather than changing the world. They react to change instead of making it happen. Clark Kerr himself wondered whether the days of what Isaiah Berlin termed hedgehogs, university leaders who were big-picture thinkers, had come to an end. Kerr saw institutions of higher education dominated by foxes who pursue many activities and seize opportunities without having any unified vision to guide them. Kerr did not explain how a fox could recognize what constitutes a genuine opportunity in the absence of the hedgehog's vision, but perhaps he hinted at the problem when he concluded, "To the hedgehogs of the 1960s, of which I was one, rest in peace. To the foxes of the 21st century, great expectations for your success in your attempted escapes from the maze." Now, I do want to close. I think there are some hopeful notes, and I want to just touch on some. I do think that the fact that public law schools traditionally have served their region and their state presents some challenges for national rankings and an increasingly global profession, but it has the benefit of creating very tight-knit communities. A lot of you will graduate and you will know each other, you will become peers, you will become a part of a powerful alumni network, and in California, I have to say in Southern California, UCLA has a remarkable alumni network, and it has been a huge advantage in gearing up to preserve the traditions that were inculcated in these classes. And that is one reason I think that our participation rates in alumni giving grew faster than any other top 20 law school in the last 3 years, because people care about each other and they care about the school. So I do want to say in closing, I just want to say that for me the questions that surround the public law school are of intense significance, not just for our profession but for our society. It is no accident that I accepted a deanship at UCLA School of Law, one of the great public law schools in America. I have spent my entire career in public legal education, and I believe deeply in its history and mission, and most importantly, I am dedicated to its future. As I reflect on why I became a dean, I am reminded of a famous essay that Jill Kerr Conway wrote about her decision to accept the presidency of Smith College. She described how torn she was about taking the job should it be offered to her. Though she would be joining a small private college, she worried about her ability to get things done in the face of bureaucratic obstacles and administrative headaches. And here's what she wrote: "Where would I be most effective? What could one person do to shape events? I'd already begun to be haunted by the time consumed in the bureaucratic processes of administrative life as Vice President of Internal Affairs at the University of Toronto. One had to process so many feelings for others, wait while the people with minds for minutia fussed over petty detail, listen endlessly to complaints about the human condition. Some days I would count how many hours closer I was to my death." Hours in which nothing had happened but the same repetitive human complaints or ritual committee maneuvers that were substitutes for thought. Despite her misgivings, Conway ultimately accepted the presidency because she thought that she could have a real impact on women's education. She aspired to prove to a doubting public that a women's institution could thrive in the modern world, that in itself it embodied important aspects of modernity. And she was convinced that if I were successful, it might be possible to make Smith an intellectual center for research on women's lives and women's issues. Her faith in a hedgehog's vision, undoubtedly coupled with the skills of a fox, enabled her to achieve many successes as the first woman president of Smith. This account is, of course, an affirming one for anyone who assumes a position of university leadership. I do not underestimate the differences between a small, private women's college and a large public research university. But Conway's story is a testament to the importance of having a lodestar, fundamental values and core commitments that carry us through the vexing and the mundane. But I also recognize the unique challenges that arise when the lodestar is rooted in the conception of being public. The very notion of what counts as public is sprawling and amorphous and itself an object of intense contestation. What happens, after all, when the lodestar explodes into 1,000 points of light? At public law schools, our task must be to restore a coherent and compelling vision of the citizen lawyer as the epitome of professionalism. If we do, then perhaps we can help to ensure a second act, if not for Clark Kerr himself, then for the public law school and for the vision of higher education that he nurtured. He will be, and we will be, exotica no more. Thank you.